Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the Atlantic slave trade. And the Atlantic slave trade is one of the worst events in human history. We have had slavery before in world history, but the Atlantic slave trade is almost its own separate entity. It's just so different than the other types of slavery that we've had. But a lot of people don't know that there was slavery going on in Africa at the time, and the Europeans just took advantage of it. It wasn't like the Europeans came in and just started capturing Africans. They just took advantage of the slave trade that was already going on. So today we're going to talk about the beginnings of the slave trade, the conditions of the Atlantic slave trade, the trip that the slaves took, and go all the way to the end of the slave trade in the 1800s, early to late depending on where you were. When we talked about exploration, we talked about how the Portuguese came in and set up port cities along Africa and basically took over the Indian Ocean trade with the Swahili states and then the Swahili states. Same thing's going to happen with our West African states. We're going to see Europeans come in, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, and make up port cities. Through these port cities, the Europeans are going to take advantage of the African slave trade. Remember, Africans had been enslaving each other. If two tribes were at war and one won, they would enslave the other tribe. And so the Europeans just took advantage of it, and the Africans, liked that the Europeans, at least the Africans that did the enslaving, liked that the Europeans were taking advantage of it because it means that they had access to European weapons. So the Europeans would give weapons to the winning African tribe, who would then give them the slaves that they had captured. Now, why did Europeans need slaves from Africa? So remember when we talked about exploration, the Spanish conquistadors came into Latin America, Mexico area, and South America, and basically ended the Inca and Aztec civilizations. They came in, took over, and enslaved the people of the Inca and Aztec civilizations in surrounding areas. But the conditions were so grueling in Latin America, especially on sugar plantations, that these people kept dying out. And if they didn't die out from the grueling condition, they died out from smallpox. And so your free labor source was dying out so quickly. So the Europeans, particularly again the Spanish and the Portuguese, turned to the African slave trade. So that's why they started bringing Africans over, was to replenish the free workforce that they had had with the Inca and the Aztecs. So the Atlantic slave trade is also known as the triangular trade, because the trip kind of looks like a triangle. Okay, so we have Europe, and the Europeans take weapons over to Africa, and the Africans take the weapons and give the Europeans African slaves, and they go over to America, north or south. From America, they get sugar, tobacco, cotton, goods of some sort that are brought back to Europe, and then it continues on. So that's the triangular trade. The trip from Africa to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is what makes this, in part, so terrible. So we'd have these big slave ships, and they would put hundreds of African slaves, particularly male African slaves, onto these slave ships. But they don't have room for them to each have their bed. There's not beds for everyone. And so they would basically just stack live bodies on top of each other, but not straight out. Each slave had about the space of 4 feet by 4 feet. Now, I'm about 5 feet tall. I'm 4'11", so I'm not even 5 feet tall. So even I would have to scrunch down in a 4 foot by 4 foot space. Imagine a man who's 6 foot tall. Horrible, right? I mean, you try and get yourself in a 4 by 4 foot space. It's not comfortable to be in that position for very long. And so they would have to stay in that position for hours at a time, being chained up, basically lying on top of other people and having other people lie on top of you. If you had to go to the bathroom, tough luck. You would basically just have to go then, and dysentery was a problem because of the horrible conditions and hygiene and food supply of the ship. And so if someone had to go to the bathroom, it basically trickled its way down. So if you were on the bottom, it really sucked for you. And again, that led to the spread of disease even more. The slaves were brought out every once in a while to exercise. Basically, they were forced to run around the ship. If they tried to jump off the ship, basically kill themselves to get out of the horrible conditions they were in, they were severely punished. About a third of the slaves died before even making it to the Americas because of the conditions. But it was worth it to the slave traders monetarily, so they kept doing it. Value of life wasn't noticed in the slave trade, at least not the value of the African lives. So if you survived the trip from Africa, you were often branded. You know how a cow gets branded? You get a hot metal rod and place it on the cow, get branded, and sold off. If you happen to be in South America, your lifespan was very short because of the grueling conditions of the sugar plantation. Sugar cane to grow needs a lot of manure, and if you don't know what manure is, then go look it up. And so people would have to carry tons of manure in baskets back and forth and work, 14, 15-hour days. It's just terrible conditions to make the sugar. They also had caves, mines that they would go in to harvest silver. And if you know anything about working in mines, it's very dangerous. And they didn't have security measures back then. Often children were used to work in the mines, and parents would chop off the hands of their children in order to keep them from working in the mines. That's how bad conditions were. If you happen to go over to North America, particularly British North America, conditions weren't nearly as bad. You tend to live long enough to be able to marry and have a family. And even though you couldn't leave your plantation, you could pretty well marry freely within the plantation. The slave owners often let that up to the slaves to marry. And if you want to read about marriage of slaves in North America, it's actually pretty fascinating because it was very matriarchal, that the women actually chose their husband and not the other way around. They would have suitors come and they would come choose their husband. Anyway, so it was much better conditions working on the cotton fields or the tobacco fields versus the sugar plantations. You had to live much longer lives, long enough to where you could reproduce. And so slave owners in North America didn't have to keep bringing slaves in because they could keep them long enough to where they could have children, and you kind of get the idea. But in South America, they were dying off so quickly that they kept having to bring over slaves from Africa, and that's why the slave trade lasts so long, is because there's so many dying off in South America. The Atlantic slave trade is going to have two main effects on Africa. The first is loss of population. Obviously, this is going on for at least 200 years. More, depending on what area of the world you are. In Brazil, they're not going to end the slave trade until like the 1880s. And so, you're going to lose a lot of population from Africa, and that's going to hurt our African societies greatly. Also, you're going to have an unequal sex ratio. You're going to have a whole lot more women than men because more men were taken over as slaves, and that's going to lead to a lot of social problems. The slave trade is going to end throughout the 1800s, starting with England. A guy named William Wilberforce, who is a member of Parliament, is going to spend his whole life, basically, his whole career in Parliament, pushing to the end of slave trade. He basically brings it up every session that he can to get it to pass, eventually gets it to pass. His preacher was the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. And his preacher had worked as a captain of a slave ship and then had a come-to-Jesus moment. And from that come-to-Jesus moment, he wrote Amazing Grace. And so the song Amazing Grace really pushed William Wilberforce, was a motivator for him to end slave trade in England. Again, it's going to end in other areas of the world. Other Europeans are going to stop at different times. Brazil's going to be the last one. There are going to be other forms of slavery at this time as well. The Irish are going to be treated like slaves by the English, either in England or in North America. They're either brought over to either of those two places. If you ever want to read about it, there's a great book that I'll try and link below about Irish slavery and how the Irish were treated so poorly by the English throughout, 1800s. We also have indentured servants. Those are people that come over, especially from England, that tell their employer, hey, if you pay for my way to America, I'll work 7 years for you for free. and after that I'm free to go and get a job, whatever. And so it doesn't sound like slavery, but the way that they were treated often resembled a form of slavery. So sorry for the depressing video. You can't really have a happy video about slavery. But that's pretty much covers it. Again, be sure to look in your book to get more information about the Atlantic slave trade, and I'll link below the book, a link to the book about Irish slavery. I'll also put in the playlist the story of Amazing Grace and a trailer for the movie Amazing Grace, which is about the life of William Wilberforce. That's all I have for you this video. I'll see you next time.